So that's another gross misdirection, because that entire discussion actually falls out of place. And the one that we should have about 179 2B1 is nowhere in the judgment with respect. Then, my lord, the point we make about the doctors, at least it's common cause that the doctors say that, or rather the correctional services officials say that there is no prison in South Africa which is capable of catering for Mr. Zuma's medical needs. Now, what that means, my lord, is that if your lordship says he must go back to that place, it's like saying there's a fire there, and your lordship says, well, go into the fire. That's what we mean when we say your lordship's judgment is an equivalent of the death sentence. Because if they're saying they can't cater for him, and your lordship says he must go back to that very same place where the medical doctors say they can't cater for him, and the prison authorities, then what else is going to happen except that he must die there? And then, my lord, Mr. du Plessis says this is not a case about sentencing. Well, let me say this, my lord. Your lordship, whatever wording is used, is effectively imposing a new sentence on Mr. Zuma. Because your lordship knows from the documents, Mr. Zuma is scheduled to be released on October 2022. If your lordship's judgment takes root, then he'll be released in 2023, because there'll be 3 or 4 months that is not counted. Now, that's firstly changing the sentence of the Constitutional Court. That is increasing that is changing the release date, which is already written and cast in stone. And if that is not punishment or a further sentence, then nothing is a further sentence. Because if a man was going to be released on the 12th of October 2022, but is now, on your lordship's interpretation, going to be released in 2023, then and we say, no, that is not a matter of sentencing. Well, that's the same as if you was sentenced to 3 months in the magistrate's court for an offense. It's exactly the same effect. And it is those issues that your lordship correctly pointed out that needs to be taken into account. What are we dealing with here? If we extend that release date for 80, by that time, he'll be 81 by the time he's released, according to your lordship's new timetable. And it is not even clear if your lordship has got the power to change the release date that has actually been determined by correctional services. Yet another executive decision already taken, it's tabulated there. This is the date, this must happen, this is the date that might happen. So all those, my lord, cumulatively should lead your lordship to the inescapable conclusion that a higher court would come to a different conclusion. And finally, my lord, Mr. du Plessis also misrepresents my argument. He says the dilatory reference of the matter to the full bench as Mr. Mpofu would like. Well, Mr. Mpofu is me. I said to your lordship, we have put in the notice of application for leave to appeal that the matter should go to the SCA, alternatively to the full bench. It is the other part, it is the National Commissioner that has put it the other way around. And then Mr. du Plessis decides to misquote me and misrepresent my argument while I'm still here, in the name of Helen Sulzman Nocher. As the court pleases, my lord, that is, those are our submissions, that this is a case, my lord, that cries out for, because of its implications, because of the resentencing, because of the rewriting, for that matter, of Section 75. Because now, under your lordship's new interpretation, Section 75 should start with the word, subject to Section 79, the National Commissioner may release a prisoner. But Section 75 doesn't say anything of that sort. It doesn't say it's subject to Section 79. It says if you are under 24 months, you may be released at the decision of the National Commissioner. Full stop. Yes. That's what it says, as the court pleases.
Thanks, Mr. Mpofu. Mr. Mpashele?
Please, Your Lordship. But I think the respondent to this matter, and I think I'll first have to deal with the submissions that were made by Mr. Chairman. and he made this following submission. He made a submission that the application for medical parole was lodged in terms of Section 79. And however, he says that, however, the application does not meet the requirement of Section 79. And in support of his own contentions and submissions, he made reference to what the application is saying, in particular, to the medical report that has been submitted by Dr. Mafa. And he submitted that in terms of that application, the question that has been asked there is that, is the offender suffering from a terminal disease or condition? And the answer thereof is that, is it chronic? Yes. Is it progressive? Yes. But however, he says that when coming to the question as to whether has it deteriorated permanently or reached an irreversible state, he says the answer there was deteriorated significantly. And he took issue with the fact that the answer thereof was not that it is permanent or irreversible. However, my lord, if this application has been made in terms of Section 79, then it's important for the Honorable Court to have a look at what the Section 79 says. Whether that Section 79 make any reference to that the condition itself should have deteriorated permanently or reached an irreversible state. Section 79 does not say so. It only says that any sentence offender may be considered for placement on medical parole by a national commissioner in this instance, if such offender suffering from a terminal disease or condition. There are no wording into which relates to deteriorated permanently or has reached an irreversible state. So this word, we're not quite sure whether this is because of the old act or what, but did not appear in the act. And further, in the judgment, it was also stated that the Dr. Mafa does not say that Mr. Zuma has in those conditions or terminal disease or condition is a condition which is irreversible with poor prognosis and irremediable by available medical treatment, but requires a continuous palliative care and will lead to imminent death or within a reasonable time. Those provisions are not in the Act, my lord. And these are the conditions upon which they've been used in order to come to the conclusion that Mr. Zuma was not terminally ill. But these are not what the Act requires. The Act requires whether it's terminally ill or not. And that question has been answered in the years by Dr. Mafa. And that's supposed to be sufficient by itself. That's the first point. And now Mr. Jamie then went on and then dealt with the issue of agency. And he considered that the issue of agency was disputed by the parties. And then he went on to say that the fact that this matter was convened, or this application was convened urgently, makes the matter urgent in itself. But your lordship would see that the point that was taken in relation to agency was whether the parties or the respondent in this stage would obtain substantial redress in due course. And the point that we took on behalf of the National Commissioner was to the effect that if this court was to say that the sentence that was served by Mr. Zuma while he was outside prison would not serve for the purposes of the computation of his sentence, that in itself is a substantial remedy. And if that is a substantial remedy in due course, then that does not make the matter itself urgent under the circumstances. Having said so, and then move to the submissions by Mr. Duplessis. And the point that the submissions that we made was that the medical parole obligation was done in terms of Section 79, as was said also by Mr. Jamie. But Mr. Duplessis then make an emphasis on the fact that the medical parole application itself must state that Mr. Zuma is severely incapacitated. But now, your lordship would see that after all, the issue of severity is not stated in relations of in relation to incapacity, but is only in relation to the limitation of daily activity. Because now when you look at 79.1a, it says that either is suffering from a terminal disease or condition and does it, or if such offender is rendered physically incapacitated as a result of the injury, disease, or illness, so as to severely limit his daily activity in mid self-care. It doesn't say that he must be severely incapacitated, as has been suggested by Mr. Dipulsi. So the next point then Mr. Dipulsi says the following. He says that the test for review is whether the decision itself is irrational. Of course, my lord, is correct, and also the fact, but however, it does not state the fact that is the decision such that is a decision which a reasonable decision maker could have arrived at under the circumstances, which is the second test. Now, the test is of irrationality in itself does not presuppose that the decision, my lord, should be correct. So the test is not whether the decision is correct, but whether the decision itself is rational and reasonable. So that being the test, then your lordship has to scrutinize the reason that were provided and determine as to whether they were rational and not as to whether they were correct or not. But however, we submitted that the decisions that was taken by the National Commissioner itself was irrational under the circumstances, and it's a decision that could have arrived at by a reasonable decision maker under the circumstances. Now, the last point then was taken by Mr. Labuskaghni, and that point relates to the issue, and he made reference to the fact that this court cannot, deal with the issue of agency, because agency in itself is not appealable, because it's the issue of agency, like in any interlocutory application, is not applicable. But and he makes reference to the Presbyterian Church decision, my lord. If your lordship could look into that particular case, that case was decided even before the Superior Courts Act was promulgated, the one that we're making reference to. And our submission is that, after all, it's not an authority to the effect that an issue on agency cannot be appealable. In particular, where we are making reference to the fact as to whether the applicant in an agent application has substantial redress in due course. On those bases, my lord, we then submitted that the application for leave to appeal should be granted with cause, my lord. And lastly, the point that we want to make is the ruling that was, or the finding by the court, which says that there is no suggestion that Mr. Zuma is an innocent party, and that he will unduly benefit from a lesser punishment than those imposed by the Constitutional Court. We've made our argument in respect of that. We've pointed out that sentence itself runs even irrespective of the fact that the person has been granted parole. And I think Mr. Mpofu have also alluded to that fact extensively. And therefore, we then submitted that he was not a party to the decision making by the National Commissioner. And I wonder how can it then be submitted that he is not innocent under those circumstances, that he has got nothing to do with the decision. All that he did was to make an application. The application was considered, and that application was granted. So he is innocent, and therefore is entitled to the benefit of a just and equitable remedy as is provided for in our legal system. And with those arguments, my lord, we submit that the application for leave to appeal should be granted with cause, as the court pleases.
Thanks, Mr. Mphahlele, and thanks all counsel for availing yourself on such a short notice and be able to prepare and present such a comprehensive argument. I will make an extempore judgment This is an application for leave to appeal by the then National Commissioner of Correctional Services, Mr. Fraser, and the third respondent, former President of the Republic, Mr. Zuma, to the full court of this division, alternatively to the Supreme Court of Appeal against the whole judgment and orders this court made on the 15th December 2021. It is tried that in order to be granted leave to appeal, an applicant must convince a court on proper grounds that he has prospect of success on appeal and that those prospects are not remote, but have a realistic chance of succeeding. It bears mentioning that the scope for granting leave to appeal has been widened by Section 17(1)(a) Roman figure 2 of the Superior Court Act when there is some compelling reason why an appeal court should hear the appeal. This matter raises an important question of public law arising from the interpretation and application of Section 75 sub 7 read with Section 79 of the Correctional Services Act 111 of 1998 and the regulations promulgated thereunder. In my view, this matter merits the Supreme Court of Appeal's attention to bring certainty in the correct interpretation and application of these provisions. I'm also of the view that there is a reasonable possibility that another court may find that the order that the third respondent's time spent on medical parole should not count towards fulfilling his sentence, as this impacts on him unfairly in that, one, it was not his decision, but that of the commissioner to be released on medical parole. Second, his meeting with his political allies and a prayer meeting was a once-off thing. His freedom of movement is restricted, and this has an impact on his dignity. He is serving his sentence, albeit outside prison. Third, because his illness and advanced age, what I want to say is because of his illness and advanced age, he needs compassion, he needs empathy and humaneness, which is the essence of Ubuntu. In my view, another court may take this into consideration and come to a different finding. Accordingly, for the above reason, leave to appeal is granted to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and that cost will be cost in the appeal. Court adjourns. You are all excused.
As the court, please.
Thanks.